How you doing today? My name is Keif Roberts, and I'm a bookseller here at Kinokuniya. Today we're speaking with author and sports writer Chris Herring. Chris Herring is a senior writer for Sports Illustrated. He previously spent 5 years covering the NBA for ESPN and 538, and prior to that, spent 7 years at the Wall Street Journal, where he covered the New York Knicks. He lives in Chicago and teaches at Northwestern's Medill School of Journalism in his spare time. Hi, Chris. How you doing today?
I'm doing fine. How are you?
Doing great. Doing great. Thanks for joining us. So firstly, Chris, let me say that I love the book. I love Blood in the Garden. As a lifelong Knicks fan, there was so much there that I didn't know about. So many unique insider details that brought the story of the 90s Knicks alive. It's a sports book, but the drama and cast of characters have universal appeal. Um, did you set out to make the book more accessible to non-sports fans?
Well, first of all, thank you again for having me on and for reading the book, for enjoying it as much as you did, and for the kind words about it. Absolutely. I mean, I think I'd be pretty embarrassed to show people the first version of the book and the first version that I kind of showed my editor, just because I'm a first time author, and so the first version of it, in my estimation, was not very good. Of course, I don't know that when I'm turning it in, and just it's kind of like taking a test and you've put time into it, but maybe it's not quite as much as you could have studied. It wasn't because I hadn't done the research. It was just kind of more like, let me try to read. And maybe this is something that other people don't do. It's hard to try to read books as you're trying to write one. But I spent a lot of time kind of reading and rereading some books that I really love, um, as a way just to try to figure out, like, how do you attach certain ideas and concepts, and how do you kind of stay on target with the theme? How do you introduce concepts that maybe aren't completely central to the team or one person, but maybe important in the grand scheme of things? How do you try to write about a breakup between an executive and the team, or a player or a coach in the team, in a way that is fair and even handed, particularly if you don't get an opportunity to speak to one of the people involved? So I had a lot of questions kind of running through my head, and yeah, I mean, I absolutely, by the second, third, fourth time I wrote through this, and I really did take three or four cracks at it, which is part of why it took me so long to write. By the time I was done, I felt really confident that even someone that was not a diehard Knicks fan, or and this is other people saying this, not even just me. I think the Wall Street Journal had this in their review, that you don't even really have to be a basketball fan or sports fan to really enjoy the book. And that maybe is left better in the hands of people that aren't sports fans, but certainly I've read a number of reviews on the different sites, on Goodreads and Amazon and stuff like that, that have suggested that you can really enjoy this thing even if you have like a really elementary understanding of basketball or the Knicks. And that absolutely was a goal, because look, I think with somebody like Michael Jordan and the 90s Bulls, you've got just enough people that are intrigued by maybe the greatest player of all time, who I think this far into it now, 30 years removed, we could also look at and say he's kind of had a really unusual life, in the sense that he, left the sport as maybe the greatest to ever play the game, went to play a completely different sport at a professional level. His dad was murdered in the middle of his career. There have been conspiracy theories for years about whether he left the sport under duress, whether he was forced to leave the sport. And oh, by the way, they won 6 championships in 8 years. So you don't really have to light much of a fire under people to get them to watch or read about him. I do think that some people would naturally have the question, like, well, why the Knicks though? Because they didn't ultimately win anything, because they only had one star, because they haven't been any good since. Like, why write this book? So yeah, I wanted to spend an ample amount of time to try to figure out what sorts of goodies am I putting in here or leaving in here for people that might not like the Knicks, that might not know anything about the Knicks. And that was a big focal point for me, and a big point of emphasis for me.
Okay, great. So you grew up in Chicago. How did you become interested in the Knicks? I mean, you had a great franchise, especially in the 90s, like you just said. in Chicago. How did you become interested in the Knicks in particular?
Yeah, well, I think first off, I still live in Chicago now. I guess I lived in New York for 7 or 8 years, but I was only 4 when Pat Riley got hired as the Knicks coach. So you take that and then maybe look at maybe by the time Jeff Van Gundy was done coaching them, I was 13 or 14, but I was a kid more or less for most of the Bulls run. Certainly by the very end of it, I was well aware of kind of who the Bulls were, but more than anything, I was just kind of, a kid that, like anybody, liked the idea that the Bulls had a parade here downtown every year, and just thought it was like an annual, just like a going back to school parade or something like that. Like it was just natural that they always had one. I didn't know any different, but I was not a diehard fan of them. By the time I started paying attention to them, the Knicks were really, I won't say they weren't rivals anymore, because rivalries linger as long as, the star players of those teams are still in the league and playing against each other. But the Bulls and the Knicks were not playing each other in the playoffs every year anymore by the time I was of age to understand it. So the Knicks weren't compelling to me. I didn't know anything about them. I'd heard Patrick Ewing's name before, but I probably couldn't have told you what team he played for by the time I was 8 or 9. I just wasn't that into it. Really, what, the most honest answer to your question is that I covered the Knicks from 2012 to 2016 for the Wall Street Journal. And while I was on the beat, I guess I started to get a sense of how meaningful the 90s Knicks were to fans. Anthony Mason, one of the main characters in the book and one of the key players from those teams, passed away really unexpectedly in 2015. And there was just a real outcry, and not outcry, but outpouring of love and I think sadness to some extent, because this was maybe the guy that people most closely attached to those teams are connected with, just like the physicality and the toughness and the emotion of those teams. I think maybe you could put Starks on that list, but I think just as many people would put Mason at the top of it as well. 2 guys that kind of came up together in the NBA at the same time. So that kind of opened my eyes to something, but I think even more so, and this is the most honest answer I can give you, a literary agent approached me and basically made it known that he was looking for someone to potentially write a book on the 90s Knicks and just needed to find the right writer. He, like anybody in his position, very wisely has conversations with people from the publishing houses that are trying to make decisions more or less on what to bet on for books that they think will do well or that they think a lot of people would like to buy. And lo and behold, a number of the people that he talked to that run these publishing houses all live in New York, because these publishers are all headquartered in New York, and a lot of them are Knicks fans. And so they, from their prism, they want to read about something that they're passionate about, but I think also wisely recognize that that they have a huge fan base. It's a fan base that has not had much to cheer for the better part of the last 20 years. And had some real characters on those teams in the 90s. And as I had hopefully put in the book, a team that even if you didn't like them, or even if you weren't a Knicks fan, was completely integral to those 90s years. Even when they didn't win, they were still in the picture every year. They had a lot to do with the way the league would play their games, and a lot to do with why the league eventually changed their rules. And were in the way of the Bulls, even though the Bulls did outlast them each time Jordan was in the picture. They were in the Bulls' way each time, which kind of made them a focal point, even if the Knicks didn't win. And so in some level, I also think that there's a bit of a tragic kind of history with the team in terms of how they lost. And, a couple of people I talked to said it was kind of like Shakespearean in terms of how close they got a couple of times, and it just kind of unraveled on them. And I think in some ways that makes them more interesting than a team like the Bulls that we've seen a lot about, that we've read a lot about at this point, that we've had a lot of documentaries on. Scottie Pippen just came out with his own book. Phil has written numerous books. Michael's had books written about him. Now he had his 10-part documentary. Rodman's had a book. We more or less, Steve Kerr's had books written about him. So we more or less have heard just about everything there is to hear. I think, maybe I'm wrong, but about those teams. And I think if it's so interesting to hear about how close sometimes Michael came to not winning, the flip side of that is turning that on its head to look at the teams that came really close to almost winning and how much torture they kind of had or suffered because of Michael being in the way. And so that was the thought. And then when I decided to do it, I had been on the fence about it. I think a lot of people my age or maybe younger, I just turned 35, sometimes think, well, I want to come up with a concept that's my own. I don't want to just take something that someone's throwing my way. But I thought about it and it's like, well, I'm relatively young. I don't have any children. I'm not married. This might be the most open opportunity I really have to take on a project like this. I knew it was going to take a long time. I know it'd be difficult. I had just lost my father right before I started working on this book, which took a huge toll on me and took a lot out of me and made me apprehensive to want to really take on anything that was going to be time consuming. I won't say I was in a dark place, but just a difficult place emotionally and trying to kind of navigate those feelings and those thoughts. So it took me a while to come around to it, but I eventually agreed to it and figured, this could be a really good kickstart to a writing career as far as being an author, aside from just being an NBA writer. And, looking back, it was definitely the right decision.
Okay. Thanks for that. And actually, I think I read a quote by Jerry West once. He said that this isn't verbatim, but that there are more interesting stories in the losing locker room than there are in the winning locker room. So just to follow up on your point you're kind of making there.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So you did just mention your parents. Did they inspire you to write? Did they encourage you to write? I mean, your parents?
I think if I'm being honest, I think that I kind of discovered the passion on my own a little bit more. Like I was never a kid that was just a whiz kid in math or science. I kind of shied away from those things. My dad kind of helped me weasel my way out of taking physics when I was in high school. And really, I just think, people talk about like the left-sided versus right-sided brain. I've always been way more talented as a writer and skilled as a writer. So that's one thing. But my high school that I went to in the suburbs of Chicago was one that had and has still a school newspaper that comes out, I think, every 3 weeks, a TV station that they broadcast like news segments once per week, maybe twice. I think it's once though, with the students and everything. And then they have a radio station where they broadcast the games live on the air. They have people that DJ after school and stuff like that. And so they've got like original programming, which is kind of cool and certainly unusual when you talk about high school, having all that at your fingertips and the availability to do that. So in my case, the way I really got into it at first was that my best friend, whose name is Marcus, we were talking, I think, at the beginning of our sophomore year about what classes we were in and kind of what classes we were enjoying. And I still remember very vividly him mentioning a journalism class. And I was like, "You're in a journalism class?" And then he started talking about it. And I was just getting so jealous of how cool it sounded. And so I kind of mentally, told myself, I'm absolutely taking this class the next opportunity I get, which at that point, I think it was a year-long class. So I couldn't enroll in it until the next year when I had an elective as a junior. But I would get home and it was like the first homework I wanted. It was really the only homework I wanted to do. It was like my journalism homework and like putting together stories or putting together, reading newspapers to try to figure out answers to questions or how things were done. And I always had kind of read the newspaper anyway, just because of my interest in sports. But for some reason, it never really clicked for me that up until that point that this is what I want to do. Like I would read the stuff and would put so much weight on what the reporters were saying and, the way they would ask questions of the players after games were over. And, you'd see the press conferences and it was just like, I wanted to do that. So that was probably the first impetus for me. And then after that, so after I got into that, my mom told me that when she went away to college at Michigan, which is where I went, my parents actually met in Michigan as grad students, that she at one point had been majoring in journalism and thought that she wanted to do that. She didn't end up doing it, but she did end up working in marketing, which, as is still a form of messaging and kind of, mass distribution and stuff like that, as far as getting the word out to people, which is, I would say, the other side of it. But it's still interesting that it's not worlds apart from what I ended up doing. And then my dad, on some level, was, again, like kind of glimpses of what I wanted to do, but not quite. He was a professor, and he wrote several books, all of which I have on my shelf. And but he's an academic, so his style of writing was a lot different than mine. But he always, before he passed, had wanted me and kind of urged me to at least give thought to maybe writing a book someday. And maybe he was always kind of jealous of my ability to just kind of write in a plain spoken way, in a way that's not unapproachable, that isn't unapproachable, or I guess that is approachable. And so, I mean, this was probably not exactly what he was thinking. He was a sociology professor, so he wrote a lot about race and diversity and, different gaps in society. And, he always wondered if maybe I could find a way to marry that with the idea of my sports coverage. But, but I know not even deep down, I know for sure he and my mom would both be proud. And so I think in some ways, maybe not directly influencing the book, but their interests kind of were interests that I ended up picking up on too, whether it was because of them or just something that happened naturally for me.
But we have a lot in common, Chris, because my dad was a philosophy professor. He passed away last year, but he was a philosophy professor. So we both have that oh, thank you. And
absolutely,
condolences on your parents.
Thank you.
Okay, my next question is so this book is about the rough and tumble Knicks, and it fittingly starts out with a fight. Can you talk about what happens and how this sets the tone for the book?
Sure. Well, as you said, Pat Riley comes in. He is, hands down the central character of this book. My agent actually asked me a question at one point and said, when we started looking at possible design covers, we've got 5 people on the book cover, and it's Starks, Ewing, Oakley, Mason, and then right in the middle of those 4 is Riley. And my literary agent said, "Are you sure you want to have Pat Riley on the cover?"
Right here, we have here's the cover. Let me just show. Oh, sorry. Let me just show you.
Sure.
Is that?
Yeah, I see it perfectly.
It's a great picture. This is like a perfect. But you have all the characters here, and
we used 3 photos. We used 1 photo and then like 2 composites to plug Riley and Starks into that, because initially it's just a photo of it's actually a photo of Ewing, Oakley, Mason, and then Greg Anthony is in the corner of it. So we cut the photo so that Anthony's not there, but then we kind of photoshopped Riley and Starks in from 2 different photos. So it took us a while to put that together, because believe it or not, it's kind of hard to get 5 people standing exactly the way you want them standing.
And they all look pretty,
in the order surly. That you want them.
They all look pretty surly.
Right, which is very fitting. So so anyway, to your question, Riley takes over. He's the central character of the book by far. And my literary agent had made the joke about whether Riley should be on the cover. Absolutely should be, because to me, the day Riley walks in, the organization changes. And the first day that he coaches them in an actual practice in training camp, 15 minutes into that practice, there's a massive fight. Riley had them doing a rebounding drill that was, some people said it was like a non-contact rebounding drill, which even makes it funnier. The idea that these guys were not supposed to really be locked up with each other and engaged with each other, but that, it was a really hot, nasty, humid day inside the gym. They're practicing it with no air conditioning, and it just kind of got guys hot under the collar. Anthony Mason is trying to engage in the rebound drill with the guy named Xavier McDaniel. Both are new to the team. Both are really strong and not guys you would want to mess with. And Xavier McDaniel, being more of a veteran, is tripping guys intentionally and kind of tripping their feet, so that each time they go up to jump for rebounds in this rebounding drill, that they tumble over, as opposed to actually getting an advantage toward, grabbing the rebound. So he's winning the drill that way. He's done it twice. The second time, Anthony Mason realizes that he's probably doing it on purpose. So Mason warns him in a vulgar way, if you do that again, I'm going to hit you. McDaniel doesn't care, because he's thinking about it. He's like, who is this guy? Anthony Mason was not a known commodity in the league. He bounced around and played in different countries. So right after that, Xavier McDaniel does it one more time to a teammate of Mason's and McDaniel's, a rookie named Patrick Eddy. He falls over and McDaniel gets another rebound. And so Anthony Mason uses that as an opportunity to hit him square in the jaw, which starts a fight that probably lasts for a solid minute and a half. Maybe less, but it was a pretty serious fight considering that this is like day one. But now looking back on it, and maybe even at the time, it immediately set a tone for how this was a team that, pardon my French, was not going to take any shit from anybody. These players certainly weren't. Certainly Mason, certainly McDaniel. They were guys that would fight at the drop of a hat anyway, with random strangers, with teammates, with opponents, certainly. Sometimes with coaches. If you think about Charles Oakley hitting Paul Silas square in his chest one time during a practice. So this was a team that really was indifferent to who you were. And I think to some extent, Riley wanted it that way. Whether or not he orchestrated it so that there would be a fight that quickly, I'm not sure. But he was someone that really didn't mind a little bit of edgy sort of physicality, occasionally violence. He called for it. And I think more than anything, that moment set the tone for what this team would be, which was a physical team that maybe was a little bit too emotionally charged, and maybe sometimes was going to step over the line of what should be done or what was really allowed by the rules, by the league. But that moment, I think, crystallized it as well as any.
Okay, and so let's continue on with Riley. So in 1991, he was hired by the Knicks. Can you talk a little bit about how he carved out a unique style for the Knicks that differed quite a bit from his previous gig, which was with the Lakers, the Showtime Lakers? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Of course. So the Lakers were, a team that, if we're talking, I'm trying to think what would be the comparison. Like, they were just this really beautiful up-tempo team to watch, a player that smiled all the time. If you're watching Winning Time now, which was based on, the Showtime book done by Jeff Pearlman, Magic was just an electric sort of player, not only on the court, but his image off of it. A team that just basically would glide up and down the court because they were just so athletic. They were so they were such good passers. They were fast. They had more talent than everybody else on offense, certainly. But even from a defensive standpoint, they were wildly talented. You look at that, and that's not what you think of when you think about those Knicks teams. Riley coached the Lakers with a certain amount of toughness on defense, but the reality was because of how free-flowing and beautiful their offense was to watch and how up-tempo they were, that overshadowed anything else that they were doing. Certainly the way they played defense, or the edge that Riley wanted to play with on defense. So because of that, when Riley took over the Knicks, I think people were somehow kind of expecting that he would coach them similarly, and that the Knicks would kind of be more of a Lakers-oriented system. But there was no Magic Johnson to run that system for the Knicks. The Knicks were actually a team that everything from an offensive standpoint had to go through their all-star center and Patrick Ewing, who was a guy whose knees were already starting to kind of bother him and betray him. So by no means was this going to be a team that was playing up and down and really fast and really flashy. They were going to be kind of a grinded out, we'll win our games 83-79 sort of team, which certainly is not everybody's cup of tea. After having watched as many games as I watched to kind of get a sense of how that era looked, I don't blame anyone for that not being their cup of tea. It's really not mine either. But that was kind of the way that, Riley saw them as our best shot here, as he'd seen with the Pistons years before, was to try to just make the game ugly, to, when necessary, be really, really physical, and sometimes kind of hurt Michael Jordan or maybe his teammates to try to have a chance at beating them in a series. The Pistons had done it a couple of times on the way to winning a championship. The reality is they got too old to really carry out that style of play at a certain point, and Michael got stronger. Michael started lifting and started preparing like, maybe a football player as opposed to a basketball one. And anyway, Michael did beat the Pistons in 1991. So when Riley comes in 91, 92, he's basically telling the Knicks, I think that this strategy actually works really well against the Bulls. I just think that a younger team needs to carry it out. I think it's our best chance to win. No, you've got to be in really great shape to make this sort of strategy work. You're not going to be well liked throughout the league if we do this, but I'm a coach that whatever it takes to win, that's what I'm willing to do. And so I want you guys to be behind me. I want you guys to join in. And if we do this, I'm telling you that I think we'll have a chance. And lo and behold, a team that had been swept by the Bulls in 91, all of a sudden, with largely the same roster in 92, a few guys swapped in and out. Starks is a bigger part of the rotation. Certainly Mason was new. Xavier McDaniel was new. But most of the other guys had been on the team already. Greg Anthony, I guess, was new as well. And they all of a sudden go from 39 wins to 51. They go from being swept in the first round last year by the Bulls to all of a sudden winning a first round against the Pistons, who, again, were getting a little bit old. And then in the second round, take that same Bulls team that had swept them the year before and take them to a game 7 in Riley's first year. And that was the changeover that he'd made, was that he basically told them, we're going to lose all areas of softness with this team. This is a team that we want people to fear us, and we're going to play that way. And lo and behold, they certainly did that over time.
Okay. Okay. So each chapter has a unique title. So there's Chalk Outline, The Butterfly Among the Buffaloes, Shattered, etc. How did you come up with those chapter titles?
You know, I it's funny. I really didn't think about it that much until I was done. I mean, certainly until I was done with each chapter, I kind of went through at the very end and titled them. And I remember having some people, I posted, when you're an author, you're always trying to figure out how to promote your book. Certainly a first-time author, you're always trying to figure out, what can I do to put this out there? And also not have everybody hate me for how much I'm going to tweet this out. So one of the things I remember getting at one point, you get the proofs of what the actual inside pages look like. And they get you the first few very early, just what the titles of the chapters are, the table of contents, the initial title page and different stuff like that. So I remember being really excited to see that, because then that's probably, to me, the very first time that it started to feel like an actual book when I saw those things. Just the font that they're going to use and how the pages are laid out, you know, as far as the words and everything, the type. So I tweeted that out when I got it, when I started getting PDF versions of what the pages looked like. What I remember when I tweeted that out was a lot of people getting excited, but also a few people saying, like, why bother titling the chapters? Why would you do that? And you know, like, and it's one of those things where, like, well, I learned how to do math this way, so whenever anyone does it this way, I'm thrown off. And so you get some people that are just like kind of old school traditional, which I, you know, to each his own, to each her own. Everybody's different. I view this book as like a creative process, and the players were extremely weird and unusual, and the team I'm writing about is unusual. So I don't see any reason to just kind of title it and just, you know, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, or you know, I have a friend, a really good friend named Miriam Fader, who titled her book about Giannis Antetokounmpo, which hit the bestseller list as well, just like mine did. All her chapters were kind of one word, which I think that that's creative in its own way. You know, but I'm also in the middle, for research purposes, reading a book right now that has no titles on the chapters. And while that's fine, that, you know, read the book anyway, it's not a problem. But if someone wants to research one certain thing, again, if people are fans of a team that's maybe not the Knicks, and, you know, for instance, I know there were plenty of Rockets fans that have never really seen their team just written about, just them. But I had a lot of people that wanted to read, you know, that were supporters of my work, that want to read just a chapter about the Rockets, or they want to start there and about the 94 finals. Okay, you could probably look through the table of contents and take a relatively decent guess as to which chapter that is involving them. You know, knock Michael Jordan to the floor is probably going to involve the Bulls. down in flames, it might be a reference to the Heat. I guess maybe not a dead giveaway, but more or less, like, there's a chapter about Anthony Mason, and that chapter has his name in it. So I think it more or less kind of speaks for itself. But chalk outline, 36 hours in Reno. Trying to think of maybe another good example of one. Whack-a-mole. I just think it makes you more like, what is this? I have a nephew who's 7, who I bring him stuff for Christmas every year. And one of the most fun things for me as his uncle is just watching him kind of study the gift before he opens it. And I think there's something to be said for that when you're writing a book and you've got chapter titles that are not just standard titles. Like, the book is a creative process. Why take your foot off that pedal in the very last lap, when, to me, the titling the chapters was probably the most fun part. I had a lot of fun with that. I just think one chapter was titled after a Sopranos episode, which you read the chapter, you get a sense as to why that is. Maybe some people didn't catch that. Sopranos are in New Jersey, the Knicks are in New York. Like, enough people from that region, I think, would understand it. Certain people noticed it immediately when I tweeted out the table of contents that they're like, oh, is this a reference to the Sopranos? So you're having fun with it. Some of it is maybe inside baseball, but not so much to where nobody will get it. But you want to hook people any way you can. And I just kind of feel like it's one additional way to do that.
Okay, great. Okay, so my next question is, instead of just interviewing star players and coaches, you chose to interview bench players and lesser known members of the organization as well. Like, why did you make that choice? I'm curious.
Sure. Mostly because the way I see it, people have seen, if something really explosive was said, for instance, by Patrick Ewing, John Starks, Pat Riley, certainly, the explosive things they said and did during the 90s have more or less been out there already. So to me, I think it was kind of incumbent upon me to try to talk to everybody else. In addition to those people, you make every effort to talk to everybody, but the likelihood of getting one of them to give you like a bombshell detail when they've already been quoted as much as they've been quoted because they were the stars of the show are slim, unless you have a completely different question that you're asking that they've just never been asked, which, again, the likelihood of that is smaller. So for me, what I found is, one, I went into this project with kind of a mandate that I can't have any, not that anybody gave this mandate other than me, but I don't want anyone that was a diehard fan of this team to open this and read it and feel like I knew all this stuff already. To me, if that's the case, I've done you a disservice. You've paid money or gone out of your way to get a copy of the book from the publisher or my publicity person. You've read it, which, for me, just picking up a book and reading it, I enjoy doing that, but I'm not necessarily the fastest reader. So if I'm going to take however many hours out of my time, a couple of weeks to finish a book or whatever, when I could be doing literally anything else, I want to make it worth the people's time. Knick fans, we've talked already about the idea of trying to make it accessible to people that were not Knick fans. So the best way to do that, in my opinion, was to go to everybody that might know anything, everybody that worked for the organization during those years. Certainly the players and the coaches and the assistants and the agents, sure. But let's also get the people that are never asked about these subjects to understand also there's a whole business side to this too. It's not just a basketball team that goes out and plays. It's not a high school team. It's a business, a big business that got a lot bigger during that era. So helping readers understand that requires more of kind of a bottom up approach that you have to take to understand those dynamics. And so I started at the very bottom. The first few people I interviewed for this book were people that potentially were there on that first day of practice that you asked about before with the fight. They were people that more or less, I've seen blogs before and stuff that they're entirely based on kind of I think there's one called Lost Letterman. And the whole point of the website is to do interviews with people that were a big deal at one point, but have been off the radar for 15, 20 years. And so I was interviewing people that were parts of the 91, 92 Knicks, either in training camp or for that whole season, that just nobody's ever, nobody has uttered their name in 15 years probably. But I really want to talk to them because I'm asking about a very specific fight that only happened for a couple minutes that maybe 20, maybe 30 at most people saw. Some of people have mentioned it and referenced it, but they all give the same basic details. But the way I viewed it, and maybe this gives you a better prism into the way I think about it, again, Patrick Ewing will have been asked about that before. Jeff Van Gundy will have been asked about that before. I remember these quotes about that fight kind of getting traction when Anthony Mason died, because Mason was one of the guys involved in the fight. So who can I talk to? Like, these were guys that had 15 years, 10 years, 12 years, 13 years of Knicks history because they were with the team for that long. Ewing in particular, Van Gundy in particular, because Van Gundy was there from the early 90s till 2001, whenever he left. So based on that, what I really wanted was to find someone who was only there for a year or two or a few weeks, maybe just a week in that training camp where that fight happened. Don't you think that if they're only there for a couple days, their recollection of a big fight would be a lot more vivid than someone that spends 15 years with an organization that's being asked about everything? And quite frankly, all the fights that Patrick Ewing saw being with the Knicks for 15 years and practice, you know how many fights he probably saw in practice? So why would that stand out to him? It's not to say that, I'm assuming he has a bad memory. It's me saying that he's got more memories to cycle through to try to remember that, as opposed to somebody like Patrick Eddy, who, again, one of the first 5 people I talked to, and he's not only telling me that he remembers the fight, he's like, I'm the reason they fought, because Xavier McDaniel tripped me and Mason had my back. And by the way, Mason was like my best friend on that team. So you immediately get to the source of kind of everything by talking to some of the guys that nobody remembers. But you realize in interviewing 200 people, you've got so many opportunities to get all this information that nobody's ever parsed through. And part of it is that they never won. Again, so much of the focus is on the winners. The Knicks never won. And so people just kind of, we know they were interesting, but, we don't know how interesting or how many more interesting stories we'd get if we talked to everybody. So that was the goal for this.
Okay, thank you. So you talked a little bit about Patrick Ewing. So Patrick Ewing is a notoriously reticent interviewee. His the perception about him, at least when he was playing with the Knicks, was that he was that he had an antagonistic might be too strong a term, but that he had a kind of cool relationship with the press. Were you able to talk to him for the book, and how did you find him to be?
So, in full transparency, no, I wasn't able to get him. I did speak to him in the most just kind of basic sense. I knew I was going to start doing this book as of January of 2019. I agreed to do it in January of 2019. It basically took 3 years from the process of signing that contract to, then the book coming out in January of 2022. So one of the first things I wanted to do once I got an opportunity, for a few different reasons, but more than anything, hoping that, just like anything, if you write someone a letter and you handwrite it, I've seen someone like Jeff Benedict, for instance, who did a book called The Dynasty. It's about the Patriots and the 19 year run the Patriots had with Tom Brady. He handwrote a letter to Robert Kraft. Now, granted, Jeff is also a #1 New York Times bestseller, where he co-wrote the Tiger Woods book that did so well and became a documentary. But I imagine that sometimes handwriting a letter in today's day and age probably goes a lot further with certain people. So he got a good response out of that, and the Patriots actually kind of gave him carte blanche to sit in on stuff over the last year or two of the Patriots run, which is pretty remarkable. So, that goes so far. And I think in the same way, meeting someone in person as opposed to just trying to call a publicist, emailing a publicist, calling someone directly when you don't have their number, they don't know how you have their number, may not always go over well. It's a thought, it's a last resort, but Patrick Ewing is probably not, for someone that is reticent the way you said, probably not really the ideal person to do that with. So I thought about how to approach him. And quite frankly, I think the other thing too, the media is overwhelmingly white. I think it's even more of a conversation today in light of what happened at the Oscars last night. I think that kind of comes to light very quickly, is that the media is overwhelmingly white as far as how it writes about things, how it reacts to things, but also just the makeup of who is in the media. And so I think it does something for a lot of athletes. And I've witnessed this several times being a reporter now and having been in the media since I got out of college in 2009. When you're talking to athletes, particularly athletes of a certain age, they're always a little bit more, they're always a little bit surprised, I think, frankly, when they see a Black reporter, because there just aren't that many of them. Every now and then, maybe there will be for whatever reason, but it's not standard. It's not what you normally see, let alone someone that's younger and Black as well. And I think there maybe is a little bit more of an openness sometimes. I don't want to say trust, but maybe a little bit more of an openness that because someone looks like you, that they might be able to relate with you a little bit better, that they might try a little bit harder to get the story of your life accurate and correct. I'm not sure, but I think there's always kind of more of a belief that might happen, I think, than just like a random person off the street that is just, someone that they've seen that looks a lot like everybody else that covers the sport. So I introduced myself to him here in Chicago. The Knicks had him. They were trying to use them as their good luck charm for the draft lottery the year that Zion Williamson was coming out. So that was, I think, 2019. Well, it was 2019. It was the summer of 2019. So probably May, June, whatever. And so I introduced myself to him. I handed him a business card. I said, I just want you to know I'm working on the book. Would really, really love to chat with you, obviously, because you are, the star player from that team. And, people remember you fondly. It would be really, really helpful to have your 2 cents, for what happened during that era and just kind of, your recollections from that era. So he shook my hand. He was extremely kind about it. He said, I'm happy to talk with you. Just go ahead and set it up through Georgetown, and we'll be happy to arrange a time. He's been the coach there, for at this point now, what, 4 years, 5 years, whatever it's been. So anyway, they were on board to help me get him for the book. They said we can't allow it now just because he is in the middle of a season and or he's about to head into a season. So it might have to wait until the season's over. But after that, we could set up a time in the spring and the summer sometime. What ended up happening, the pandemic started after that season was over. It actually ruined the end of the college basketball season. So there was no end of that season. In some ways, the pandemic starting, as awful as it was kind of helpful for me in some ways, because now all of a sudden, everybody that would be really busy and traveling and recruiting and everything else is at home, including probably Patrick. But I also needed to get to a certain stage in my reporting before I was fully comfortable interviewing him, just because you don't want to interview someone and not have all your ducks in a row. You don't want to interview someone like him and not have all your ducks in a row or not have all the information you want to have. So anyway, I say that to say this. I was getting closer to that process of reaching back out to see if I could interview him. What ended up happening, I wrote, and you've read the book, so you know this. I don't think I was being disrespectful, but I was trying to be truthful and trying to understand the dynamics of certain things that happened in Patrick's life, including some pretty rough off-the-court stuff. Detailed his wrist surgery that stemmed from a really nasty fall he had in a game. I then go from that to saying that less than a month after that, it was exposed that he was having an extramarital affair with a team dancer. And, within that same year or so, he had been sued for sexual harassment on a team flight along with Charles Oakley. So in a nutshell, I started asking questions of different people about some of those instances, including someone that was tied to the dance team during those years. And, I had plenty of questions about just how the dance team operated and how it was founded, because that happened during the 90s as well. But after about 15 or 20 minutes, I pivoted away from asking questions about the formation of the dance team to then ask questions about the fraternization between the dance team and the players from time to time. And of course, asked a question about Patrick. And I heard the person on the other end of the phone get really uncomfortable. It was so awkward. But she was like, okay, so I'm just going to tell you, me and Patrick are very close friends. We've, maintained a friendship for a long time. He actually, I'm divorced. He actually, after that happened, essentially set me up with one of his best friends. And to this day, I'm married to one of Patrick's best friends. And we're so close with Patrick that we're very private people, but we had a wedding with 5 people in attendance. And we waited until the NBA schedule allowed for Patrick to be able to attend my wedding, until Patrick was able to come up to New Jersey for a weekend, on a weekend where the Orlando Magic, the team he was assistant coaching at the time, was able to come to New Jersey. So that's how tight I am with Patrick. I was like, oh. So that, if you can read between the lines, what that means is that I'm nearly certain that it got back to Patrick from her, that I was asking questions. Again, not beating anyone over the head. I don't think I was asking about anything that was terribly inappropriate. This is just his life. And to be fair, like, a lot of this stuff was out there already. That certainly was a big deal when it happened. So I'm just trying to collect more information on it so that I can tell the story in a truthful way. I was not being overly salacious, in my opinion. Not trying to be, at least, and it was trying to be respectful of it. But that at that point, I stopped hearing back from Georgetown and people that would have connected me to Patrick. So I did not get him for the book, but it was certainly not a lack of trying. I interviewed a lot of people in his corner from his childhood, from his college days, from his high school days. People that coached him, opponents, and what have you. So I made every effort. The same is true. I did not interview anyone that's on the cover of the book. Starks, Ewing, Riley, Oakley, Mason. Mason obviously passed away in 2015, but I made every effort to get the other 4. That happened with Ewing. Oakley had a book that came out 2 weeks after mine, so he was not really looking to divulge much because he had his own book coming out with his own details and wanted to safeguard that. John Starks not coaches, but he works for the Knicks today, and the Knicks are not the most media-friendly organization, to put it lightly.
Actually, let me, can I just interrupt you for a sec there?
Please,
let me ask you about that, because they don't, like you said, they don't have the best reputation with their relationship with the media, in terms of journalists being able to freely access players as well as members of the organization.
Sure.
What did that become an issue with this book?
Yes. In terms of, it depends on whose court you put the ball in, but John Starks' people told me very clearly. I approached this foundation about interviewing him, and they said, we're happy to let you interview John as long as the Knicks say it's okay. And to me, that's like, you might as well at that point be saying, of course, I'll send you back to Kansas as long as you kill the Wicked Witch and bring me a broomstick. Like, at least in that movie it happened, but that was not going to be the case. Like, the Knicks are never going to just sign off on a media request. Like, I can't remember them ever making anyone available that they didn't have to. For, not to say that they didn't make someone available, like, in the locker room, but they never will, like, oh, sure, we're just going to pick up the phone and we'll have this person call you. That I can't remember. I covered them for almost 5 years, and I don't ever remember that happening. Maybe I'm forgetting one time. But no, they're not looking to be helpful from that standpoint, which to me, I don't want to be dramatic about it, but I think it's a little bit sad, just because we're talking about a team that overachieved by all, possible measurements. This team overachieved, outkicked its coverage as far as how many games they won, how close they got to winning a championship when they were clearly never the most talented team. John Starks is a beloved figure who, I think one of the weirdest things for me is that if you look around enough, what you have to do when you're doing a book, you've got to try to research every article that's essentially ever been written on this team from those years, the day-to-day stuff in the day-to-day paper, stories in the paper back in 1991 to 99, and then the magazines and everything else. But what I was weirded out by is like, John has done so many interviews on this stuff before with like random podcasters, with, frankly, not to demean them, but like kids and people that are in college, fresh out of college. When I first started working on this book, I was really essentially working with ESPN. Had covered the Knicks, was more than fair. I still have contact with some of the people that I covered during those years that I was tough on. I was not, out of line. They would always say, like, we appreciate that you at least give us a shot to respond, which is fundamentally different sometimes than what the tabloids would do. I worked at the Wall Street Journal, so we were not really reporting just from a gratuitous standpoint. I remember when the whole thing with Derek Fisher happened, is it related to Matt Barnes? And like the tabloids had a field day with that. Like, I was writing for the Wall Street Journal, so we really weren't jazzing things up just for the sake of like, ooh, this is a sexy story about like potential infidelity and like marital issues and the head coach. And, did he get beat up by a former player, former teammate? I wasn't really chasing that, because to me, at the end of the day, the story is kind of like what's happening on the court. And does that influence what's happening on the court? Maybe. Like, I think you'd have to have someone tell you that. So I was always willing to kind of keep it to the court. And certainly I'm not going to close my eyes to stuff that's happening off the court, but it was still a question of relevance to me. So I said that to several people. The Knicks knew that, and they knew that was how I covered the team. I was more than fair in how I went about covering the team, which I think is why some people that recently left the Knicks, or, had just left the Knicks a year or two before my book was done, were willing to talk with me, because they remembered that about my work. So it absolutely impacted the book, because I didn't get Starks. For all I know, I'm not sure that the Knicks ever even passed along that I asked to speak to him. I think they made the decision for him. I asked to speak to Jim Dolan, which I knew that was never going to happen. But there were other people within the organization as well that would have been extremely helpful to talk to, that work in an alumni capacity the same way John Starks does. You think about Allen Houston. Allen Houston is, in their front office. They made no effort to let me speak with him. It absolutely had an impact on the book. From that standpoint, it would have been great to have gotten all of them. They were all integral to those teams. But from where they sat, they pretty much just have like we don't see how it helps us, so we're not going to do it. It's a book that will be on shelves hopefully forever, certainly in the New York area and libraries and stuff like that. But just more broadly, you would hope it'll just be around for a long time, just because this was the last time they had a good team. And, more of the stories are going to be positive than negative, because I think, unless there had been like an OJ situation where it's involving them and it's something really heinous, or an Aaron Hernandez situation, we're not talking about overwhelmingly bad stuff here. It's about them winning with a really unique style that was so different that the league had to outlaw it. To me, there's no advantage to not helping, but I just kind of feel like they're so used to saying no that that's kind of the way they treated this as well. So yeah, it absolutely impacted the book.
Yeah, and I think that the book is really entertaining without being salacious. I have to say that's I found it to be like very, very entertaining, and I didn't get a sense that you were dwelling on any salacious details or anything like that. So my next question is so like the Knicks of the 2000s and beyond have had considerably less success of their compared to their 90s like counterparts. So what do you hope current fans who are too young to have experienced that decade get out of this book?
Just that they understand. I think, like for me, like I was saying, I did not have the greatest, deepest knowledge on these teams. I'm not someone that only came around in the 2010s, but that was really the first time that I started paying close attention to the Knicks specifically. And you do get people my age and younger that fall in love with the team. And it's possible to do that without any knowledge. maybe like the jerseys. You know your fans, your family grew up and they're Knicks fans, so you're kind of grandfathered into it. It's just your local team. You have a soft spot for teams that lose. Whatever, you know, you really liked Jeremy Lin or you really liked Carmelo Anthony. There's any number of reasons why people would like the Knicks or want to be Knicks fans. I just think it deepens your fandom even more if you really, really love the team. And that's without even knowing the history of what made them really, you know, I think for fans in the 90s, a lot of what it was just they were such underdogs with the way they were viewed. They had two guys in their basically in their starting lineup or that played the most minutes who combined did not play 4 years of high school basketball. I don't even know they fully played 3 years of high school basketball combined between Anthony Mason and John Starks. He had, you know, Kurt Warner had that movie made about him pretty recently. I mean, you had John Starks who was bagging groceries a couple of years before he was later named an all-star for the Knicks, and a guy that was listed at 6'5", but really was only 6'2". You know, you had Anthony Mason who played all over the world before he got an opportunity. You know, Jeff Van Gundy was someone who did not really fit the typical profile of a guy that would have been an NBA coach. And it really made him kind of sheepish in some ways because he figured these guys aren't going to respond to a guy that's 5'9", that's never played in the NBA before. So the roster, up and down the roster, you had a lot of guys that were kind of underdogs. You really had one legitimate star. But this, because they were underdogs and because they were scrappy and because they couldn't always really keep their emotions in check, which again makes me think a little bit about last night with the Oscars. I just think the Knicks, in a way, connected with the people of New York, because I think New Yorkers like to think of themselves as kind of scrappy and fighters and, you know, maybe not always having the best, most ready-made situation to thrive in, but make the best out of what they have. And certainly feel like they can go toe-to-toe with anybody, whether they should or not, should be able to or not. So people fell in love with their fight and with their grit, with their attitude, with the idea that they were intimidating. A legion of fans hated them because of that in Indiana and Chicago, Boston, Miami, certainly. But a legion of people in New York really fell in love with them. And so I think having a deeper history and being able to say what made them unusual, aside from just like, man, they were really physical. Yeah, and that's true, and it would not be the wrong answer, but how? Like, you know, and I'm hopeful that my book sheds some light on that. I'm really hopeful at some point that, you know, the book will maybe be made into a documentary or a docuseries or something, because I think as much as I made every effort to bend over backwards to try to describe it through the way I saw it or what I was reading or what I was being told, I still think there's something to be said for seeing it and just being able to see how visceral and physical this team was, that maybe doesn't come across on the pages, which is how kind of violent they were. We have a book trailer for the book that I think shows some of that, but I just imagine over the course of an hour, 2 hours, like it probably jumps off the screen just how physical they were relative to everybody else, certainly relative to today's NBA. So that was the thought process.
Okay. Okay. So do you have any new books planned, and can you tell us anything about them? I think you did mention that you're researching something, right?
I did. Yeah, I guess I can put it out there. I mean, I'm working on a book now. Just agreed to do it last week, officially. I'm writing a book on the Miami Heat from those 2010 years. You know, LeBron, Dwayne Wade, Chris Bosh. That's the hope. It'll probably take the better part of a couple of years for this as well. I'm a little bit, I won't say concerned, but it'll be a challenge, just from the standpoint, I think that all the things that made this first book a little bit more tangible, the fact that 20, 30 years had gone by, I think people open up over time about how things happen. And, you know, there's nothing to be lost by sharing more details about that. That might not be the case right now at the Heat, who still have the same coach and still have the same team president and Pat Riley as when all this stuff was happening. Granted, Wade and Bosh have retired. LeBron is still, he's certainly not the middle of his career, but he's still in his career. And so may not want to really go back to a lot of that stuff. So it'll be more of a challenge just because I think the Heat happened right in front of all of us. Social media existed by then. So there was that. They were a huge spectacle every town they went to. ESPN was covering them with 5 reporters at the same time every day. So that, it does raise the question of like how much material is out there that has never been before. But I do think that they captivated more people than those Knicks teams did. Just because, like I said, love them or hate them or love them. I mean, like they made so many enemies just even with that like initial parade they did the day after LeBron agreed to go to Miami. So I think that there's plenty on them that's not out there. I'm hopeful that there is, and that's what I'm hoping to tackle at this point.
So is it going to be called The Decision or?
No. I think right now I mean, it's so early. Well, we could end up changing it. At this point in the process with the Knicks book, we had Blood on the Hardwood as the prospective title. It obviously changed to Blood in the Garden, which my editor wanted just to have something that would be able to tie it more to the Knicks, just in case you hear about it or, want to have a tie-in. With this one, we haven't figured it out just yet, but the one that I put forth as like a tentative idea was Playing with Fire. Just because I think that there were a lot of moments in which this team did or said something, the players from the team did or said something where it could be perceived to kind of be a mistake that would then come back to bite them. The idea of kind of preemptively bragging about how many titles you're going to win. And, the look on Pat Riley's face as LeBron was doing that, where he just looks like mortified because he knows from firsthand experience how hard it is to win championships, but also how hard it is when you put that out there as bulletin board material for everybody else. The idea of laughing and kind of poking fun at Dirk Nowitzki in the middle of the finals for his illness, and then Dirk coming back to win the series. There are all sorts of things, like the way the roster was built in a really top-heavy fashion where you've got 3 really highly paid guys, but then on the back end, you realize you don't have that much money to pay everybody else. And then that ends up being kind of one of the roster's undoings, is the idea that, the luxury tax is killing them on the one side, but also they just don't have enough money left over if LeBron wants a maximum contract again. So there were all these things. I mean, that's 3 of them, but there had to be 50. I haven't even really started reporting on it yet, but Playing with Fire is kind of the tentative idea I've got. And it's not really out there yet. I'm keeping it relatively quiet just because I think it'll be easier to do it. I think if I'm bothering the Heat about it less now, and I've worked my way up to the people closer to the top of the organization, just because it's a current thing now, still with certain people in place. And if they shut it down all at the beginning, then it probably makes it a little bit harder to do if they tell their people, don't talk to this reporter. So I'll do my best to kind of tiptoe around, but figure I'll tell you, why not?
And also Chris Bosh is the medical drama with Chris Bosh. That's interesting.
Yeah. There's so much stuff. I mean, to me, that's probably more the epilogue, since he retired after the run was over. But between him, Wade left the team and then came back, which was a whole thing. And people were, Wade still feels a certain way about that, as far as the Heat not, in his mind, not respecting everything he'd done for the franchise, and maybe not respecting how much money he'd left on the table to make the LeBron Bosh signings possible. But I think most people would tell you Pat Riley's a pretty loyal dude. I mean, he still has Udonis Haslem on those rosters. He's basically a guy that hasn't been able to really play for 3, maybe even 4 years at this point. But I think has agreed to keep him on the team essentially so that he can earn back the money that he lost by taking less, so that they could facilitate LeBron and Bosh, which is a pretty amazing thing. So it's a team that sticks together pretty tight, which is, like I said, why I'm saying I've got my work cut out for me to try to get people to open up about this era, because this is a group that sticks together, that very loyal, that it seems like Riley's incredibly loyal to most of these guys. So I'll have my work cut out for me.
And don't forget the Knicks, the video they put together to lure LeBron, the Sopranos video.
Yeah. Wow. That whole thing. Yeah. The come on, there was that. And then I remember I was covering politics when that first happened. I was covering New York City politics, and Mayor Bloomberg backing a "Come On LeBron" campaign, I think it was called,
Right.
which was the corniest thing I've ever heard of or seen. But I mean, worse things have happened. Like, who knows? Maybe all LeBron would have wanted was a Michael Bloomberg video. So if he hadn't done it, you would have, kicked yourself if that would have made the difference. But yeah, it's crazy to think about how seismic that was. And if you told people that the Heat were only going to win 2 championships with that group, people would have said how. So that's, to me, that's part of the interesting thing about it too, is if you only win 2 championships in 4 years, everybody else, that's like a raving success, but I don't know that people view it that way. And I don't even know that Riley does, where he looks at it from the standpoint of like how many they could have and should have won if they'd stayed together. But and then there was that, by the way, when we talk about things that, they were playing with fire, Riley kind of challenged LeBron in the media and said, well, you'd stay, basically like it takes guts. And, if you want to be the one to like leave out the door at the first exit, then go right ahead. He said that in the weeks before LeBron went into free agency and then chose not to come back. So the idea of being challenged publicly in the media like that, on some level, it had always worked for Riley. He had all the rings and, certainly had lured them there the first time. I don't know, like Riley's always had some of that to him as well, as far as just like, the fortitude test. And not everybody is wired that way. Not everybody thinks that way, but also not everybody responds to that sort of pressure and that sort of messaging that way.
Right.
And I think that was a good example of it backfiring.
Okay. And finally, can you read us a passage from the book? Would you be able to do that?
Sure. Give me 1 minute.
Yeah, sure.
I think I've got one that makes sense to read. Okay. I'll try to keep it short. I'll try to keep it maybe within 2 minutes. All right. Somehow, Pat Riley either hadn't heard or understood the disclaimer. So when the handouts made their way around the conference room table at the Madison Square Garden offices in Midtown, Riley grabbed the sheet of photo paper, analyzed it, then wore a confused look. What he saw was ambiguous: an aerial half-court image of the Garden floor with the chalk outline of a human body lying in the blue painted area directly in front of the basket. The messaging was blunt. If an opposing player had the audacity to drive toward the rim against New York, he might lose his life doing it. Beneath the image, there was a phrase: tough town, tough team. The 1992-93 New York Knicks. Before Riley could even fully digest the first image, another handout made the rounds. This one was just as direct as the first, featuring a Mack truck roaring through the middle of the page, coming right at the reader. If you want to know what it's like to play the Knicks, stand here, it read. Again, beneath the image was the slogan: tough town, tough team. The 1992-93 New York Knicks. A few of the team executives chuckled at the mock-ups, which had been presented by a visiting ad agency. But then an uncomfortable Riley spoke up. I think maybe these go a little bit too far, he said. That's when the presenter reiterated what Riley must have somehow missed to start the meeting: that the promotional poster ideas for the 1992-93 campaign were just icebreakers, and that the unusually aggressive designs, as accurate as their portrayals were, would never actually see the light of day. Still, the mock-ups illustrated something. In just 1 year, Riley's rough and tumble Knicks had developed an unmistakable identity.
I was hoping you were going to read that one because I love that passage. I love that part of the book. It's great. Because I thought Riley would have went for I thought he might have went for that, but no.
He was not. Well, first of all, thank you. He was not someone who, and I think I had an earlier chapter that they tried to market around him specifically, that they wanted to take photos of his hands, or of his left hand, which had, I think he had 5 rings on that hand, 4 from when he coached the Lakers as the head coach, and 1 as an assistant, but I think he also had 1 as a player from the Lakers too. So I think he had 6 rings by the time he came to the Knicks. But he essentially said, I don't want to, they were going to have an ad campaign with him with a poster of that hand. And then on the poster have some writing that said he's saving the other hand for New York, which is like brilliant, really. I mean, it's obviously promising pretty big, but Riley was like, I don't want it. He basically said, I don't want anything that takes the attention away from the players. Like this, I didn't come here to be marketed around. Like I want this to be a team that wins championships. I don't care about marketing. So it obviously puts the Knicks in a tougher spot because they just want to bankroll as much as they can around Riley. Who knows if you ever win? Like they never did, obviously, but he didn't want it to be about him. So he sent them back to the drawing board with that. So he was very anti kind of look at me, at least as far as what he said. I think Riley certainly liked attention. Riley certainly knew how great he was. He demanded ownership. So of course he did. But I think that he was weird about that. And he was weird about attention being drawn to certain things. His image was one. I think the other was that he didn't want the Knicks to draw. Like if you start messaging things that way, as far as posters or promotional materials, it puts kind of a bullseye on the team's back as far as the way they're going to be officiated. And I don't think he wanted that. Like he knew they were physical. He was telling them they had to be, and he was ordering them to knock people down. But I don't think he wanted more attention on that aspect of the way they played, because he was fighting kind of a, waging war against Phil Jackson and other guys throughout the league that were saying they were too physical. So you can't lean into it publicly and then also say we're not overly physical. Why would anybody think that? Why would anyone say that? Well, you guys are calling yourself that. So it makes sense that he didn't lean into it in that situation, I think.
Okay, so thank you very much, Chris Herring. We've enjoyed learning about your newest work, Blood in the Garden, The Flagrant History of the 1990s New York Knicks. Blood in the Garden is published by Simon & Schuster and is available now. Look for the link in the description box below to get your own copy. And thanks for joining us, Chris. We're a few blocks away from Madison Square Garden, so any Knicks fans can come down to Kinokuniya and pick up their copy.
I would love to come down there at some point too and check out the shop. I've never been before, but thank you so much for carrying the book. And again, thank you so much for having me on. It's been a real pleasure to join you.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Take care. Bye.
You too. Thank you again.
Take care.